get this. I have a slide presentation I hope will help you. And for those of you who, were here when I did Ecclesiastes, no Shakespeare this time. Okay, is that showing? Yes. Okay. So yes, it's a difficult one. So what I've done, I'm going to look at this mainly at the central section, because there's 8 chapters. I haven't got time in 20 minutes or 30 minutes to look at the whole thing. So I'm looking at the central section, and then I'm going to sort of tease out and tickle some threads that come from other parts and connect them. So just to orient you to what I'm going to do, this is going to be a literary consideration of this poem, keyword. And so I'm moving backwards and forth across the poem. Arbitrarily, but to help with centering your ideas, I'm going to refer to acts and scenes as well as chapters and voices. Now, acts and scenes aren't normally and officially in this, but I'm doing that because it's of the way I'm looking at this as a narrative. So I'm concentrating on these central scenes. They're chapter 4, in particular around verse 12. And I'm going to call this part Act 2, Scene 2 and 3. So here's just a couple of, just to remind you of something you might not have looked at since you were in high school. And I'm focusing here because not only structurally is this part the centre of the poem, it's the centre of the story. And it's central to the themes of the story. And chronologically, so we have Act 1, girl meets boy, and they court. Act 2, they marry. Act 3, reality sets in. This is the scenes from a marriage part. They reconcile, they renew their relationship, and that's the end of this particular narrative. So let's have a look at some context first of all. As I said, it's a poem, and in terms of analysis, it appears to be made of several smaller poems that have been put together either by the original author or some later editor. We just don't know. So long ago, we don't have any records. We don't actually have a lot of other poetry from this period either. In the theme running through it, it's not exactly a linear narrative. It's sort of not quite that straightforward narrative we're used to. So there are some times when it's hard to be certain of who's speaking to whom or about whom. And it's hard to tell sometimes if we're being told a story or we're being allowed to share someone's thoughts and dreams. And one of the really difficult and key points to this poem is its ambiguity. And that's where we're going to spend a lot of time today. So the whole structure of the poem is based on this idea of metaphor, imagery, and symbolism, especially nature in the garden. And that's the theme that runs through the whole poem. There are very few examples in this text where there's not a metaphor drawn from the natural world, be that animals, horticulture, geography, or agriculture. So, as I said, the main thing we're going to look at today. And apart from Ruth and Esther, this is actually the only canonical book that's about a woman. And it's the only one where we have the woman's voice given precedence over that of a man. The chief protagonist in this story is the woman, and she shares the dialogue with the man, but she often speaks longer and more evocatively than he does, and she shares her first-person point of view. So neither have a name, though she does refer to herself as the Shulamite, and the man is often referred to as the groom, and in keeping with that, she is the bride. That all depends on your translation, of course. And one of the sort of more controversial things I might mention is that this poem doesn't actually directly reference God. He's not actually part of this story. At the centre is this concept of love between people, man and a woman. Some people do take the story as an allegory of God's love, which is perfectly fine, but to me, I'm looking at it as a man and a woman and their love. And their love is actually quite amorous and quite highly charged at times. It's often described in terms of nature, and so they use plants and animals to describe one another. And to a modern sensibility, this is really unfortunate. She is a palm tree that he's going to climb to get to the fruit. And, you know, ladies out there, if I was described as a goat or a mare, I'm pretty sure we'd all have the same reaction. Just don't go there, guys. But contextually speaking, this kind of description was expected and it was acceptable. If you think that I'm going to go down the path that this is going to be a modern girl's guide to love as well, which some people do use, then I think this text is so complex and so nuanced that to call it one thing or another, there's a bit of a risk in defining it as something that you're going to miss out on something. There are features that can be unintentionally ignored or oversimplified. So while, yes, the tradition of it being an allegory is perfectly fine as a guide to relationships, there's plenty in there for that too. But I think by just saying it's absolutely one or the other, there's something to be missed. So, chapter 4, or I'm calling it Act 2, is sometimes referred to as the garden poem, and I quite like that title. It's the second act of the 3-act drama. So in Act 1, everything the young woman says, it's very anticipatory. They're courting. It's exciting and their desire is very clear. But it's also clear that that desire has not yet been consummated. And it's exclusively from her point of view. There are a few mentions where he speaks, but pretty much exclusively her point of view. The garden poem, there's a bit of a shift in the tone, and from that almost overwhelming desire of Act 1, in Act 2, we shift to taking pleasure in one another, not anticipating, but taking that pleasure. So it suggests the fact that they actually have married, and although there's no actual marriage in the poem itself, it certainly suggests that in Act 2. And I think that's a key point to the poem. Keeping in mind that we're talking about larger in life characters here. We're not talking about real people. This is a young woman's journey from virginal longing to married joy. It's both literal and metaphorical, and there are many layers of ambiguity to it. So let's get to grips with this metaphor, symbolism, and ambiguity. And I'm an English teacher, I can't help myself, sorry. So the apple tree is a connective piece of tissue. We see the apple tree image in Act 1, and we also see it towards the end in the final Act 3, and we'll come back to that. But the texts that refer to the apple tree are up there for you. So this is an interplay, an ambiguous and complex interplay of ideas about being a virgin and being described as a garden in such a way that she embodies the garden. But it also suggests she owns the garden as a piece of her property. So the garden is her property, and she is also metaphorically the garden. And her marriage unlocks the garden for herself as a someone, both as a place and as somewhere. So she gives the someone and the somewhere to her husband, that gift of her chastity, the someone part of it, and the garden as the somewhere that they can share. So one reason for emphasising this ambiguity is the whole poem is the nuance of Hebrew, the Hebrew language. Now, I took this from several sources. I'm not an expert in Hebrew. It's making use of this poetic form. It's that sort of word play. And the playfulness around these ideas of ambiguity and contextual complexities. So the poem makes use of the way Hebrew can use the words he and it. They are both meant simultaneously. So she's seeking the shade of the tree as a somewhere, a place, but also of him. simultaneously. And the fruit tree is a somewhere, it is a place, and the fruit of his love becomes a someone. So those both are valid and they are simultaneous, and that's where this playfulness occurs. We're not talking about playfulness in a games and toys kind of sense. We're talking about it in an ability to manipulate and make multiple meanings from language. So this ambiguity connects the lovers to one another and to nature simultaneously. So this is why I say claiming one meaning over another. You could miss something out. So as humans, we're going to have a little bit of a range through gardens here. We love our gardens, and in our garden is a place where we like to sit and create something. We celebrate its abundance. It's calm. We bury our pets there. It's a place of connection and rest. I love to lie in the hammock and read. Michael likes to potter around. Shandy the cat likes to pretend he's an apex predator in the garden. And this is what gardens have been since the beginning. Our garden is the sort of nth great-grandchild of Eden. If we want to think of the lover's garden as a grandchild, then we go to the medieval garden, medieval pleasure and monastic gardens, as being a sort of a great-grandchild, because they are a conscious reflection of heaven. They were created with that reflection consciously in mind. So Genesis doesn't tell us a huge amount about the garden. Every seed-bearing plant, animals of all types, and the garden is created to provide for every need of its inhabitants. We don't get any sort of detailed listicle or map, but you can pretty much bet there'll be bees to pollinate things, flies to be aggravating, and there'll be fluffy bunnies to be cute, and worms to make sure the soil's properly aerated, and all of those things operating. The medieval pleasure garden, consciously modelled on Eden, is a place where people would go for relaxation, especially in summer. They'd go outside to read, to picnic, engage in a tryst. Scheming often happens in gardens. There's trees for shade, flowers for fragrance, a wall for security. There's a sense of journey because there's paths that wind through the garden and they can provide discretion, or just a sense of journey and privacy. So it was also a place for the exotic. Plants and animals were brought from all over the known world to go into these gardens, and the richer you were, the more you would have. So with peacocks and swans, small animals, even large animals like bears and lions were kept in these gardens. So our rooster, this is licorice and marshmallow, are one of these bits of exotica. Japanese bantams, which is their breed, were created in Japan 400 to 500 years ago to be living ornaments in aristocratic gardens. So the pleasure garden is definitely not just restricted to a Western sensibility. It's a universal thing. And pleasure gardens, with those winding paths and there's pavilions and all of those sorts of things, have a place of being somewhere, anywhere. They have a sense of enclosure, but not being bounded. And this is something that we can see in the young woman's garden. And the poem foregrounds this idea of her garden being a place somewhere, anywhere. So the monastic garden was often a medicinal garden, as well as that beautiful cloister garden, but it was a place of healing and succour, and cloister gardens were for contemplation. They were quiet, shady, they had trees and flowers, and the medicinal garden, of course, had herbs that were used in cooking and medicine. And as I said, its construction is designed to reflect that first garden, provide for all the needs of those in and around the garden. There were fruit and vegetables for the community within and outside the walls, support for the wider community. The vineyards and fields provided grains, grapes, and stock, of course, provided meat, milk and cheese. And so what's in the young woman's garden? Her garden has an abundance of food and ease and pleasure. So 4:12, which is Act 2, Scene 2, tells us a bit about, the young woman's garden. And this particular section is just this brief pause in the drama because the young man stops and admires the garden just as a garden. So he gives us the plants that are in there and creates a sense of being somewhere. So it's a fruitful and exotic garden, and it has local trees like pomegranates and exotic plants like frankincense. So this garden delights in nature and is in harmony with exotic and domestic combinations of plants, just as we can imagine Eden would have had. Every plant needed. He tells us about the garden from his point of view, and we hear his voice, his authentic voice talking about this place. And it's an unambiguous little section. He finds delight in the reality of her garden as a place of somewhere. But it's also becomes, too, a place of anywhere because of its combination of domestic and exotic plant life. And it's removed from the world by its enclosure, but because of its combination of exotica and domestic, it's unbounded. It can be anywhere. So if Eden is God's garden, and we know he delights in it, Genesis tells us that he walks in the garden and talks with Adam and Eve, it's a defined place, but it's given no boundaries. It has a sense of somewhere, anywhereness. The garden, we're not told about the walls until actually after the fall, that there's walls around it. There's no walls. It's unbounded. No boundaries. And this sense of ease, but a sense of enclosure because of the plant life in there. This is the garden of Saadia, an Iranian poet, and it has this wonderful sense of peace and somewhereness, but it could be anywhere because it feels unbounded. So this unboundedness of the garden is in sharp contrast to what is outside those walls. We know there are walls in this garden, but there's a sharp contrast outside and inside. So in Act 1, Scene 1, she tells her lover that he is abused by her brothers. And in the third act, she describes being beaten by the night watch. So this is that contrast inside and outside her walls. Outside is human unquiet, but within is peace and harmony. Her garden has these walls to protect it. But in a peaceful and satisfying somewhere, it's an Eden-like place. At the same time, here we go back to ambiguity, she's upending Eden. Because in Eden, God decreed that she, Eve, will desire your husband. That's it in that section. You'll desire your husband. But in this garden, her garden, as a place of somewhere and anywhere, she is his, but he is hers. And that's a really important thing. And that line, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine, is repeated regularly throughout the poem. This is a mutuality of upending that decree. And it's only possible because of that sense of somewhereness and anywhereness. This mutuality is in harmony like the garden, which of bringing together the joy and the peace, and it takes place in this garden that they share. So the garden itself is a very sensual place. In this poem, the lovers consummate their marriage, and it is also a place that appeals to human senses. It's layered with the idea that she is the garden, and his descriptions of her as being part of a natural world, although he uses the garden metaphor, he's describing her as part of the natural world, emphasises this appeal to human connection with nature when all is harmony and human senses are able to be fully satisfied. In literature, and particularly in poems, gardens are generally considered female. They are feminine to other parts of nature that are considered masculine. They're places of fruitfulness and fecundity. They're fertile and productive. The garden walls traditionally would protect the garden, and we know that she is locked into this garden initially to protect these features of her body. As a virgin, she and her garden have boundaries. As a married woman, She gives herself willingly and generously to her husband as both owner of the garden and owner of herself. He takes then a shared occupation in the garden, and the boundaries fall away. In other poetry, as in here, there's a very erotic motif that evokes female sexuality and fertility with its inherent fertility and abundance, but also a wildness. The garden is a place of human creativity. We actually make gardens, and we often make them as a reflection of our view of the world, a kind of, if I was in charge of the world, this is what the world would look like kind of idea. So think of those great gardens in England of Capability Brown, or that Japanese garden with its nature tamed and perfected. But, every gardener knows what happens. Turn your back for 5 minutes, gone. The feminised garden is also a place that is slightly dangerous and has a tendency to wildness. And our lovers don't shy away from this in their descriptions of one another and their relationship. There's a dual aspect to the feminine garden and her vineyard of fertility and wildness. And this is one of the things that is underlying the brothers' control. She tends their vineyards, a place where they can control her. Her own vineyards are abandoned, and she's denied access to them until she meets him, her beloved, and accepts him. This ambiguous femininity and wildness is recognised, but he praises it. It's feared by her brothers. He describes her as a fawn, a gazelle. Her eyes are like doves. She is like wine. She's intoxicating. She's gentle, but she's wild. She's capable of jealousy. In Act 3, there's a scene where she quite clearly points out to him, watch yourself, buddy. She reminds him that her vineyards are hers to give or not. There's a circularity to the poem which keeps coming back in onto itself, and it keeps us going backwards and forwards through the poem. So we go back to Act 1, knowing that she's a woman of some means and independence. She owns her own vineyards, but they're not tended. And as she owns them, this indicates also her position in the world until she meets him. The position where her brothers control her is in complete contrast to the shared position that she and her young man, her husband, have in the garden poem. Her brother's control and confining behaviour contrasts with the mutual respect and admiration that they share. He does not abuse her or lock her away. So in him she finds freedom, and she invites him into the garden, and she is free to give him permission. This is not a, we're married, what's yours is mine kind of. It's a permission to share. So in the garden, it's not untended, it's a very carefully cultivated garden of grows of trees and flowers, which he pauses to observe. She's not a subject of that part of the observation, it's simply the garden being a garden. He's looking at nature. But then we go to move on through that, and in chapter 5, verse 15, the tone changes and the ambiguity returns with the words, you are. Is he talking to her or is he talking about her? It's not clear at this point. And 5:16 then goes on to what is an invocation, like a spell. And she calls on the wind to blow on her garden and send its fragrance everywhere. Reminds me of that sort of idea that perfume should announce a woman's arrival and delay her departure. By invoking nature to keep her fragrance with him, she envelops him, and he is reminded always of her. And the finale of this sequence is a repetition of that phrase, I am my beloved's and he is mine. But it's not just an invitation, and it's in no way a sign of her submission or capitulation. Permission. My beloved come into his garden, as well as a gifting. Where it was her garden, it's now his, but he could not enter until she permitted it. Her vineyards, her gardens are hers alone to give. She claims agency and an active role in the marriage as a result. She is the garden, It's hers to give, literally and figuratively. The walls protect it and lock it, and she alone has the key. So in the third act, and actually the most challenging, is the culmination of the previous acts of the poem. So keep in mind, I'm an analyst of literature, not a theologian. So I consider the third act as a sort of a climax and resolution to the drama. It reminds me of an ad that's been on TV. We sort of see this young couple, we are introduced to them while they're courting, and as part of the courting, he gives her a bracelet. They marry, they begin their life together, and then, life has its way. She sleeps while he's working. She's watching TV while he's doing the ironing. They're rushing around. They're busy. They have an argument. And then we move to the one morning, sometime later. She's rushing off to work, and he comes out to say goodbye, and her bracelet, that bracelet, catches on him. As they're trying to disentangle the bracelet from his buttons, they reconnect and unity is restored. And so in Act 3, we have this kind of image happening as well. After the time in the garden, they go to a village, they spend the night there. Perhaps it's their actual wedding night, perhaps it's a holiday, we don't know. But again, we've got a change of tone from the garden poem. We've got another tone of maturation. The beginning of the marriage, we had lots of erst. Now we are going to mutual pleasure in one another. However, as you read through, there are sort of some moments that suggest a bit of trouble in paradise. He's no longer referring to his bride, suggesting that they've been married for some time, but he does still refer to her in very deeply affectionate words, his darling, his flawless ones. But they're no longer newlyweds, and the poem suggests that there's been a period of separation, and she's sort of feeling a little bit unsatisfied with things. Perhaps he's resenting that she spends too many days lying in bed, eating chocolates and reading detective novels. Perhaps he's been away for work for too long and she's just a little bit peeved at that. Bit disgruntled that his priorities are wrong. Or maybe there was just that silly argument about whose turn it was to do the washing up. We've all been in that one. But she misses him, and her inner life is now in conflict. The conflict is between her desires as a woman and her life as a wife. She dreams of him. She can't find him in this dream. She goes searching for him. However, this is where the watchman beat her. Perhaps this beating, her stepping out, is a way of indicating she's to blame for the problems. It doesn't really matter, but she's feeling conflicted. And she decides then to take some action independently of everyone else. She's worried about, this is the woman who's worried about getting her feet dirty. So in 5:3, she's, I can't get my feet dirty. But then, she gets up in the middle of the night and she goes searching for him. And this would certainly transgress expectations and shows that she's struggling with something to transgress these expectations of her place. Shows she's struggling. But she can't find him, so she returns home and asks her friends for help. Her friends then say, well, why should we? Why should we help you? Tell us about him. Why is he worth finding? So she begins describing him. I couldn't help myself, sorry. He's handsome and tall. He has dark hair and the cutest dimples. And did I mention he's handsome? And he's got this sort of goofy laugh and he's got great legs, and I just love watching him walk. He's got this way of looking at me and he's so... oh dear. This is the moment where she reconciles her internal conflict. And she realises he's been there all the time. He's in the garden. She was just looking in the wrong place. Here's where his lilies are. He's in the garden. He's there with her all the time, regardless. So they're reunited, but this time it's not in the garden, but it's under that apple tree again. We go back to the apple tree. The first meeting under the apple tree was a place of significance to her. Now it's a place of significance to him because it's the place he was given birth. So this is where the most over-the-top language comes in. But these mutual words of praise show that their love is still flourishing. They are still the lovers of longing and desire from the first act, but they've matured and there's a deeper intimacy in their language. Their relationship is maturing, but they still rejoice in their love. This is where she gives him a not-so-gentle reminder that she is capable of jealousy. She's human after all. They're no longer in Act 1 of courtship and longing, but Act 3 of marriage and maturing. And the little vignette of jealousy is a reminder that he does not own her, nor does she own him. They are together by choice, and mutual respect is part of that. They still have personal agency. She has personal agency. She gives him the gift of her garden, and she can withdraw it in 8:6. But now they're aware of the consequences of separation. Now, the word jealousy here is only hinting at the notion we have of jealousy, which is that sort of feeling I don't have something and I want it for myself, or I have something, I want to keep it for myself. In this context, jealousy is a guardian of their shared belonging. I am my beloved's and he is mine. This jealousy is the concept that we're looking at here. Belonging, not ownership. So no relationship can mature without some sort of conflict and the resolution of that conflict. So even for this larger-than-life couple in a love poem, the love that they have is overwhelming. She describes it as being like a fire, able to overcome water and floods. It cannot be bought. And at this point where she's talking about how overwhelming the love is, this is where she brings in this point of jealousy. So why do it now? Why do it at this point? Much of this poem is a picture of the relationship within. Remember, it's first-person point of view. The speakers are the lovers. They describe one another and their feelings throughout the poem from their own points of view. There's no third-person narrative. They tell their own stories and share their own feelings, describing their own emotional responses. So at the resolution of the poem and those difficult narratives, we get the real killer. I am a wall, my breasts are towers. No, seriously? I mean, that sounds more like something from a Madonna video, but it's a metaphor again, a really potent metaphor. She's the protector of the garden and of her vineyards. She owns the garden. Towers and walls protect and defend. So she is protecting and defending her garden, herself, her somewhere, anywhere. But remember, it's shared. So she's protecting them as much as she's protecting herself. She's gifted those gardens and walls and towers to protect it. And so we come to the final act within the poem, and it ends with another gifting. She says to him, "Come away with me." She says, "Let us be lovers again." And that's the end of the poem. And that's pretty much how they're always going to be, because the end. So in closing, is this a young girl's guide to marriage? I don't really think so. What we have is a poem that reflects the growth of a relationship, a courtship that's filled with thirst and longing, a marriage that allows a consummation of that longing. And then when everything seems perfect, we get a picture of a marriage relationship with its ups and downs, misunderstanding, conflict, resolutions, reconciliations. It kind of all ends happily. And I think that's the key, really, to this. For all its larger-than-life characters and its ambiguity and metaphors, there's a realism in there. It's a realism about relationships and a love that can be overwhelming and that can make people vulnerable. But mutual love, mutual respect, and the words of love and praise that they use to one another and give to one another just might be able to overcome those slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I know I promised no Shakespeare, sorry. This unsmooth course of true love, this mutual respect, admiration. So from this point of view, maybe a little bit soapy, but it ends with praises of belonging and loving and an ongoing, maturing love and all the complexity and stuff that implies.